It's an honor to introduce Young Zheng Sullivan, who is the Young Center's namesake. And Young was one of the first unaccompanied children that the Young Center served. And he's generously allowed the Young Center to use his name. And Young, we're allowing you to land here on Planet Zoom, and we're gonna do a little, perhaps he said, she said. Hi there, Young, welcome.
Hey, Eduardo. Hey, Maria. How are you?
Yeah.
Hi, Young. How are you?
Doing well.
I feel like this is like the original cast of like a chorus line or Hamilton. You know, when we land on stage, it's like, it all began here, you know? Right. Young, an opportunity perhaps for you to just share a little bit about your journey and how you ended up here in the United States, and then the intersection of Maria, and then now what we have is the Child Advocacy Program.
Yeah, sure. So I came from a very small village in southeastern China. So, you know, essentially I'm like one of those guys who was born and just kind of live his whole life within maybe 10, 15 mile radius of where he's at. And, you know, coming from southeastern China in a small village, there's very much a culture of filial piety. Essentially, you do whatever your parents tell you to do. Mm-hmm. So when I was 14 years old, my dad really surprised me. He told me that he's made a deal with smugglers, and they call snakeheads in China, and they were going to send me to the US. And from that, between that point and me leaving China was just 4 or 5 days. And just like that, I went from selling watermelon on the street to hitching an international flight to Newark Airport. And of course, I didn't speak English, and I knew nothing about, you know, any other place from where I was coming from. And the immigration official picked it up pretty quickly, and they realized that I'm not from the U.S., and they put me in a detention facility, and then they sent me to a detention facility in Philadelphia. I was there for 1.5 years before they sent me to Chicago. That's where I met Maria.
So you were 14 years old, you landed in this country at Newark International Airport. Those of us who've been to Newark International Airport know how crazy that is. Then you went to Philadelphia, and then you were there for 1.5 years before you went to Chicago.
Right.
Oh my God, it's just when you stop to think about the time of that, of a 14-year-old boy, you know, who is then doesn't know the language, completely unsure, and now he ends up in Chicago. And then Maria, how is it that you got introduced to Young?
Sure. So I just want to let people know, I mean, so Young was in Philadelphia. He was actually, it was a detention facility, and he was there for a full 1.5 years. And then they transferred him to Chicago, which is where we met. This was at the very beginning of the Child Advocate Program. And so I was serving as Young's child advocate. I do not speak Mandarin. So my first meetings with Young, I had a dictionary, a Chinese English dictionary, and we would pass it back and forth, and we managed to communicate pretty well. So what, you know, Young had an uncle here in the United States, and so what we were aiming for at that point was to get Young released to his uncle. But I just want to give you a little bit of background about how this smuggling snakehead arrangement works. So the snakeheads are the smugglers in China, and they transport people, young people, kids, and adults over to the US. And if they successfully get them here and out of detention, now that child owes money. And when Young came to the US, he had a debt of $65,000. Today, the debt is upwards of $80,000. So essentially, these kids end up being indentured servants in the United States. So I met Young in the shelter in Chicago and became his advocate, and we worked really hard to get him released to his uncle in Ohio, and we were successful at getting Young out of custody and to his uncle.
Bravo. So we think happy ending, ... end of story. Young is in Ohio. There's a show tune, Why Oh Why Ohio. I'll spare you the show tune. And then Young, what happens?
Right. So after I was released to stay with my uncle, and that's when I, you know, got the news that the way this whole system works is essentially the moment after I get released, I'm required to pay smuggler back large sum of money. At that time, it was roughly $50,000, $65,000, like Maria was mentioning. And obviously that came as a huge shock to me. I was still 15, 16-year-old. And what I supposed to do was essentially run away and get into hiding and then start washing dishes and waiting tables and, maybe spend the next 20, 30 years to pay off that amount. And I still did that, but I stayed in Ohio and I kind of, washed dishes and wait table a little bit. But at the same time, I enrolled myself to a local high school. I actually did pretty well, much to the dismay of my father and obviously the smugglers who just want their money. In the meantime, I had to report to the ICE facility in Cleveland, Ohio, once a month. I did that for several months. And then one time they told me, okay, you have been attending regularly. There's no need for you to come every month. Just check back every 3 months. And a few weeks later, I got a call and they say, hey, how come you haven't showed up? You missed your appointment. Immediately, I took a couple buses and showed up in the ICE facility at Cleveland. And they told me that they have ordered to deport me to China. And they sent me to Chicago first.
All of a sudden you arrive and then they're like, now you're detained and you're going back to China.
Right, and then they put handcuffs and shackles on me, and I was basically placed in jail overnight until they can send me to Chicago via flight.
So then you're back in Chicago, and then chapter 2 with Maria Woltjen comes in.
Right. So we found out that Young was back in Chicago and found out what happened and immediately went and met with Young. He had a solo practitioner lawyer, and we called the lawyer. The lawyer had never returned any of Young's phone calls, but we managed to get through to him. And what he said to us is, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do. And by the way, I want more money, but there's nothing I can do. So we didn't know what to do. Young knew he was going to be deported. We really tried to stop his deportation, but we weren't able to do that. Young, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk about what happened next at the airport.
Right. So I knew I was going to get deported, and essentially the only reason I was in Chicago is just so they can send me away via international flight. And in the airport, I was really scared because, prior to that, I had gotten the news that the snakeheads were really upset of me because I supposed to be paying them back the money I owed. And, essentially if I was going to return to China, they would be ready for me and my life would be in danger and the lives of my family members would be in danger. It was almost like a situation where if I would have just died in the US, maybe they figure, well, the guy's dead and there's no money to collect. Maybe they can move on. So at the time I was really scared. I know I couldn't go back to China. So while I was in the airport, panic kind of set in, and I ran towards the wall and banged my head against the wall and I passed out. So afterwards, they had to send me to Houston while they tried to get another ticket to send me back to China.
Right. So Young he was hurt, so they couldn't put him on that plane back to China. So they kept him overnight until he was better. And then they flew him to Houston to a place that was really more like a jail. And that was where we knew we had to find a lawyer for Young. So we got on the phone and made a lot of phone calls and finally reached an attorney named John Sullivan. It was late at night. I remember telling him, John, this is not going to be an easy case. It's not a slam dunk. I want you to know it's a really, really hard case. And John said, I don't care. I'm going to take this case. And he was at a big law firm, Fulbright and Jaworski. He put 5 other attorneys on the case, and they fought for a full year in almost every court, state court, federal court, immigration court, to get Young his, status to stay here. And Young, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, just like what Maria was describing, I don't know how much manpower and time and effort went behind my case, because you know, I was still only 15, 16 years old at the time. And John and his team of attorneys essentially took my case to Third Circuit Court. And at that point, they realized that given what happened to me, I actually qualified for a special immigration juvenile status if I was able to get a federal court judge to grant that. So we actually went back to a district court, and the judge agreed that in my case, I was essentially abandoned. And, you know, because most parents wouldn't send their kids away with a $65,000 debt, and they are 14-year-old and they own their own. So the judge decided that I would be able to go through family court. And then our case went to family court, and then family court judge granted my state. And after that, I was able to qualify to get a green card. And John and Christy at that point, and Christy Sullivan is John's wife, of course. At the time, they asked me if I want to stay with them. So I agreed. I moved in and stayed with them. I got my green card. And then I became a U.S. citizen. And of course, today my name is Young Zheng Sullivan because John and Christy Sullivan are my parents now.
I mean, it's like cry, tears, tingles down the spine. I mean, such a beautiful story, Young. And then now, so you got your green card, and then on top of that, talk about stepping into and realizing the American dream. Where are you now?
Right, and after I became a U.S. citizen, I went back, I got a graduate school degree, and then now I work for a big company here in North Carolina.
Amazing. So I'm just present to one, just like just imagining how a 15-year-old could do that by themselves, and it's absolutely impossible. So it is because of you, Maria, and the Young Center team that that stories like Young's can have happy endings.